Okay, so thinking through federalism and the Constitution. So you can look to the Constitution to the necessary and proper clause, which justifies powers not expressly mentioned in Article 1. And there's the Supremacy Clause in Article 6, which states that the Constitution and laws made under its provisions are the supreme law of the land. And when federal and state law conflict, federal law prevails. Okay. In terms of concurrent powers, it highlights the ways in which powers are shared by the federal government and state governments, like we've seen in these examples with the concentric circles, like police, taxes, court systems, right? Which highlights it's both state level and also at the federal level. Okay. So what can be confusing is where powers begin and end, and it can also be controversial, and it's something that's can be a pretty consistent conversation about which powers should belong to which part of government. So it's not something that's always settled. Just because things have been done, say, a certain way, doesn't mean that there isn't still conversation on, hey, that should be a federal government power, or that power should belong to the states. And hopefully we can think of some examples how. Well, one issue with federalism is inconsistent laws. Okay, so federalism and the U.S. Constitution often cause inconsistent laws to exist in the United States. For example, medical marijuana and recreational marijuana is legal in some states, but not in other states. So, this can lead to confusion and accusations by some political observers that we need a more consistent method for the law. One thing to think about is if you were to have marijuana, medical marijuana, or recreational marijuana that you bought, for example, in the state of California, but then you went on a road trip and you ended up in a state like Arizona that does not have the same laws around marijuana as California does, you or one could find themselves in some hot water if they were found with marijuana in Arizona as opposed to in California. Now, across the United States, marijuana is still, classified as a Schedule 1 drug across the country. So there's already a conflict between federal law and various states' laws around marijuana. And then in between states, right, as you go from state to state, there are different laws around it. So what do you think? Do you think that we should have a uniform approach to things like this? Or, alternatively, is it important to have these differences which reflect states' rights, their right to legislate certain matters within their borders, right? Can you think about the ways in which states who have different marijuana laws that perhaps that ought to, maintain within the purview of that state, and that if people don't like it, they could move to another state, right? So think about where you stand on this issue about having uniform laws or having different approaches throughout the various states. Can any negative or unexpected consequences happen as a result of this inconsistency of laws between states? What do you think? I'd love to hear about some examples. So please write them down. Okay, so to continue on with this example of marijuana, and I need to look to, actually, I see this is from 2016, so things have changed in the last, I guess it's been 5 years. All right, so I'll have to look for something more updated. But in terms of even highlighting, and you can see the example here showing the different ways in which a law or an approach to a law or an approach to a thing can take place in a number of different ways across the country, right? So even this is an example, it still applies right here, right? Because you can see the ways in which throughout these examples, marijuana is received in different states, from legal use, medical use, recreational use, to if you are found with marijuana, having marijuana be decriminalized from its Schedule 1, class, but decriminalized, so it's seen as less, not that it's not a crime, but it's become less common to prosecute for, to a severe, extent if you're caught with marijuana in some states, whether or not there's medical, and states where there's no legal marijuana use still. Okay, so check out this link here. I'll try to remember to link to it separately. This highlights California laws and federal law around this issue of marijuana. So, the changing balance and looking at federalism over time. So, one example is looking at dual federalism, right? Dual federalism it's really an idea. Now federalism has changed over time, but dual federalism is this kind of like clear, delineated focus and division between national and state governments, right? It would be as though there were two separate circles, national governments over here and state governments over here, right? Never the two shall meet, right? These separate approaches, okay? Another way of interpreting federalism over time has been through this idea of cooperative federalism, highlighting the overlapping and governing authority between the national and state. So those are the examples that we have seen visualized here, right, through those kind of concentric circles. Now, there have been two general trends over time. Government has both grown at both the federal and the state level, right? So that's grown over time. We've got much more government now than we did 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, right? So it's grown over time. And the gradual strengthening of the federal government. So, as a result, citizens receive more services from the government. Okay, so we can also visualize these concepts, and of course, and I love that this happens in politics. We are visualizing, understanding the concept of federalism through slices of cake. That's right up my alley. Okay, so we have to ask ourselves, with American federalism, is it more a marble cake, as we see here on the left, or a layer cake? Okay, so a marble cake on the left, that's this cooperative federalism, right? Based on the pragmatic mixing of authority and programs along the national, state, and local governments, right? Which really highlights that these two levels of government really do touch each other and have an effect on one another. We could compare that with dual federalism, which is also known as layer cake federalism, which is based on a clear delineation of authority and programming amongst a level of governments. So, let me ask you, American federalism today, is it more like a marble cake or more like a layer cake? What do you think? So there have been historical reasons for the growth of the federal government over time, over our history, and some points of time that stand out would be with the early Federalists in power, right? Would be with the Civil War, right? So the era of the Civil War, the amount of resources that it took, and then after the Civil War, in this era known as Reconstruction, right, when you actually had to reconstruct a lot of the country, right, was also, we saw an expansion of the federal government and what it does, okay? The New Deal in the 1930s and 40s with the expansion of the social safety net in this country, and the Civil Rights era of the 1950s and 60s, where we saw an expansion of the federal government at that time as well. New federalism and devolution. So in the 1980s, there was a conservative shift in the nation that led to this idea of new federalism. New federalism was a stronger emphasis on state and local government through the process of devolution. Now, what that means is the devolution is when a part of the government kind of gives up tasks that they do to another. So, for example, government spending and public assistance, abortion, gun control, and other culture wars issues. So what do I mean in this example? That means that as opposed to creating nationwide policies on these things, nationwide policies on access to abortion or gun control, or just issues around guns or other culture war issues, rather than having a singular approach to it that stems from the top down, from the federal government down. We see devolution, which is essentially the federal government stepping back and saying, well, you know what, the states should respond, right? That these issues are states' issues, and they're all up for discussion, truth be told. But it's important to consider that this era was really about pushing to get the federal government to allow the space for states to take the lead on some of these issues, which we see some of the effects of to this day. And other areas have had the opposite shifts, right? The so-called war on drugs, education, and national security. We've seen a push from states to say that this should be a national issue, that the national government should have a response to these things. For example, a national response to the war on drugs, or a national response to education through education policy, like No Child Left Behind, for example, or national security, right? Like a response or the engagement with the so-called war on terror, right? These are examples of states saying there should be a national response to these issues, not that each state should have a different approach. California from Nevada, from Arizona, and so on.